In 1884, the European powers were embroiled in key competitions over River Congo. The Britain supported the Portuguese claim over River Congo, while France and the Belgians also opposed the idea. Now, to support the matter from causing a war, the then Vice-Chancellor of Germany called Otto von Bismarck, he invited these European powers who were interested in acquiring territories in Africa. Now, the powers that attended the conference were Britain, France, Germans. The topic of dialogue is going to be the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. Now, the scramble for and the partition of Africa, this refers to the competitions among European powers to possess territories in Africa and the subsequent divisions of Africa. It started in 1880s, and by 1905, the whole of West Africa had been scrambled and partitions except Liberia and Ethiopia. But it should be remembered that before 1800, certain territories in Africa were already been occupied, such as Britain, such as Batos, St. Louis, and also Gore. These territories were occupied before the scramble and partitions of Africa. Now, the causes for the scramble and partitions of Africa: one, desire for market. Due to the industrial revolutions in Europe, the Europeans were in need of industries or markets where they can sell their products. And also in these industrial revolutions, they produce machines that can work faster than human beings. Now they were producing goods in a higher quantity, and they need markets where they can sell their products. So they decided to divide Africa among the European powers so that at least they can have a market where they can sell their products. Now, the white man burdens. The white man also believe they have a divine guidance, or they are superior to the black man. They can rule the black man. That's why when they came in West Africa, they enslaved the Africans, and later they divide Africans among the European powers. Now, the desire or inside of investment outlet. The Europeans, they need investment outlets where they can invest and also generate revenue. There was no place better than Africa. So that's why when they came in Africa, they enslaved the Africans, and also in the later years, they decided to scramble and partitions Africa among the European powers. Now, the other causes for the scramble and partitions of Africa is the European unemployment. There was high rate of unemployment in Europe, and also there was lack of space in Europe. So that's why when they came, they decided to colonize Africa. So for example, the Gambia was colonized by the British, and also Senegal was colonized by the French. So they have to bring their European people to stay in their colonies. For example, South Africa. South Africa is a country in Africa. So because of there was lack of space in Europe, they decided to come to Africa. And in fact, some of them are still settling in Africa. So these are the causes for the scramble and the partitions of Africa. Now, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. In 1884, the European powers were embroiled in key competitions over River Congo. The Britain supported the Portuguese claim over River Congo, while France and the Belgians also opposed the idea. Now, to support the matter from causing a war, the then Vice-Chancellor of Germany called Otto von Bismarck, he invited these European powers who were interested in acquiring territories in Africa. Now, the powers that attended the conference were Britain, France, Germans, the Belgians. They all converged in this conference. Now, it was in this conference when the map of Africa was brought out, and Africa was puzzled or divided among European powers who were interested in acquiring territories in Africa. No African leader was invited to attend the Berlin Conference. It was only attended by the European powers who were only interested to acquire territories in Africa. And now in this Berlin Conference, the European powers, they agree on certain conditions or terms. Now, one of the agreements that was made in the Berlin Conference was effective occupations, which means all European powers that occupy territories in Africa should make sure they effectively occupy the territories in Africa that they already occupied. Now, notifications. This means all European powers who occupy territories in Africa should notify or should inform their other European counterparts so that at least it can ensure peace among the European powers. Now, the other agreement also that was made in the Berlin Conference was the abolition of slave trade. which means all European powers that acquire territories in Africa or that colonize a particular territory in Africa should make sure they totally abolish or condemn slave trade in a particular region. So that's why after the Berlin Conference of 1884, the slave trade now was finally abolished. Now, the other agreement also that was also reached in the Berlin Conference is social and economic reform. It was an agreement that was transpired among the European powers, which means any European powers that colonize a particular territory in Africa should make sure they rehabilitate the economies of that particular country. That's why when the French colonized Senegal, they introduced a system of administration called assimilations. Now in this system, if you are born in a certain region, in Senegal for example, Gorée and Saint Louis, then you are considered to be a citizen with equal right with those that are born in France. So they have to rehabilitate the economies and also the social status of that particular country. So these are the agreements or the decisions that were made in the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Now the stages in the scrambles and partitions of Africa. Basically, there are three stages in the scramble and partitions of Africa. The first stage is the signing of treaties with the African rulers. Because the Europeans, when they wanted to divide Africa among European powers, they signed treaties with our kings and chiefs. Now, when they are done with the signing of treaties, now the treaties will pave the way for them to finally colonize that particular territory. Now, the second stage in the scramble and partitions of Africa is the conclusions of the treaty. When they conclude the signing of the treaties with our African rulers, now they know that they have a colonies or a territory that they can occupy. Now the third stage is the movement of troops. Because when they colonize a particular territory, they need to bring in their troops so that at least they can ensure peace and stability in that particular colonies that they colonized. So these are the three stages in the scramble and the partitions of Africa. These are the three stages in the scramble and partitions of Africa. The method used to occupy African territories. And also basically there are three methods of occupying African territories. One is treaties and peaceful negotiations. The Europeans, they have to come, or when they came in Africa with the intention of colonizing Africa, they decided to negotiate with our kings and chiefs. And after the negotiation, they will sign a peace treaty to ensure the smooth colonization of that particular territory. Now, the other method used to occupy African territory is the gun boat diplomacy. They have to bring in their big guns and encamp them in the colonies that they colonize to ensure also peace and stability within that particular colonies. Now, the other method also used by the Europeans to occupy African territory was the outright military conquest. When they came, they signed a treaty with our African chiefs. So in an event that our African kings and chiefs refuse to surrender their own land or territories, then the Europeans now will bring in their military soldiers. For example, in the Gambia here we have the Soninke Marabo, and this Soninke Marabo transpired between the Soninkes, who were the non-believers, and the Marabos, who were the Muslim scholars. Now there was a Marabo called Fode Kabadumia. Now, Fode Kabadumia was very powerful to an extent that resisting against the Europeans, both the British and the French. Now, when Fode Kabadumia was killed in 1901, the British now decided to bring in their big guns and place it inside the country. Now, because of this big gun, it enabled them to finally colonize the Gambia. These are the methods used to occupy African territories. The reasons for the conquest of West Africa. The reason for the conquest of West Africa. One, the Europeans were using superior weapons, while our African people were using inferior weapons. Two, the Europeans' armies were well trained and well fed, while the people of West Africa were not well trained and well fed. And four, the Europeans' armies were well professional. They are well trained, capable, while the African soldiers were not. Now, four, the African kings and chiefs, they failed to sign or to form an alliance against the European powers. That also is a factor that contributed to the conquest of West Africa. Now, the advantages and the disadvantages for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. Advantage. One, it ended intertribal wars in Africa. Because when the Europeans came, they colonized Africa. Britain colonized the Gambia. The Portuguese colonized Guinea-Bissau. The French colonized Senegal. Now, when they colonize the African countries, they ensure peace and stability. They threaten our kings and chiefs to ensure peace and stability in the colonies. Now, two, it also improved our agricultural system because they introduce new varieties of crop and they encourage our farmers to engage in commercial agriculture rather than subsistence agriculture. Three, it also improved our health system. They were able to bring in their new medicines called tablets, for example. And also they construct hospitals across the entire length and breadth of the African countries that they colonized. Yes. Now also three, they also introduced Western educations. Now this Western education, it enabled the Africans to attend. And after attending, they acquire knowledge about this Western education, which contributed to another topic called nationalism. Nationalism came into existence as a result of the Western education that has been introduced. And also five, it also led to the introduction of a religion called Christianity. Because when African continent was divided among European powers, they introduced their religion called Christianity. So these are the advantages for the scramble and the partitions of Africa. Now to the disadvantages for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. One, it led to the loss of African sovereignty. Because Africans, they totally lost their sovereignty. Now two, it also led to the loss of African lands. Many lands have been confiscated by the Europeans. For example, in South Africa, some of the lands are still in the hands of the British. Now, the other disadvantage for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa, it leads to the introduction of European culture. Because when they came, they introduced Western education, they introduced their religion called Christianity, they also now introduced their culture. So the African people accepted the European culture. So these are the advantages for the scramble for and the partitions of Africa.